There is a weight that comes with freedom, a heaviness that settles into the bones, into the marrow of our existence, transforming what should feel like liberation into something closer to dread. We speak of freedom as though it were a gift, as though the absence of chains automatically leads to joy, to fulfillment, to the realization of our deepest selves. But Dostoevsky knew differently. He understood that freedom is not simply the removal of obstacles, but the confrontation with an infinite expanse of possibility that terrifies us more than any prison ever could. In the quiet hours before sleep, when the noise of the world recedes and we are left alone with our thoughts, this truth becomes undeniable. The freedom we possess in these moments, the freedom to think anything, to be anything, to choose any path forward, does not comfort us. Instead, it unsettles. It reveals the profound paradox at the heart of human existence, that we are creatures who desperately crave freedom while simultaneously fleeing from its implications, seeking shelter in systems, in beliefs, in the very constraints we claim to despise. Dostoevsky spent his life exploring this paradox. From the underground to the boulevards of St. Petersburg, through the fevered minds of murderers and saints, he traced the contours of a fundamental human condition. We are beings caught between opposing forces, torn between our desire for autonomy and our need for meaning, between our impulse toward self-assertion and our longing for surrender. This tension does not resolve itself. It does not fade with age or wisdom or understanding. It remains constant and inescapable, the central fact of conscious existence. Consider the nature of choice itself. Each moment presents us with countless options, countless paths we might take. In theory, this multiplicity should empower us, should fill us with a sense of infinite potential. But in practice, it paralyzes. The more choices we have, the more we become aware of all the roads not taken, all the versions of ourselves we will never become. Each decision we make is simultaneously an act of creation and an act of destruction, bringing one possible future into being while consigning countless others to oblivion. This is the burden that Dostoevsky's characters carry. They are not simply people making choices, they are people crushed beneath the weight of their own freedom, desperate to escape the responsibility that comes with self-determination. The underground man, locked in his self-imposed isolation, rages against the rational world that would reduce human beings to predictable machines, to units of calculation whose every action could be foreseen and controlled. He insists on his right to act against his own interests, to choose suffering over happiness, chaos over order, simply to prove that he possesses free will, that he cannot be reduced to a formula. But his defiance brings him no peace. His freedom does not liberate him. Instead, it traps him in an endless cycle of resentment and self-loathing as he watches other people live their lives with an ease and simplicity that he can never achieve. He is too conscious, too aware of the absurdity of existence, too intelligent to accept the comfortable lies that allow others to sleep peacefully at night. His freedom has made him a prisoner of his own mind, condemned to analyze and reanalyze every action, every thought, every feeling, until all spontaneity, all joy, all connection with others becomes impossible. This is what we fear when we fear freedom. Not the absence of chains, but the presence of responsibility. Not the opening of doors, but the knowledge that we must choose which door to walk through, and that there is no guarantee, no cosmic assurance that we will choose correctly. We want to be free, but we also want to be guided. We want autonomy, but we also want certainty. We want to make our own choices, but we also want someone else to tell us that our choices are right, that we are moving in the correct direction, that our lives have meaning beyond the arbitrary decisions we make from moment to moment. The religions and ideologies that Dostoevsky examined in his work all offered solutions to this dilemma. They promised to relieve us of the burden of freedom by providing clear answers, definitive truths, systems of meaning that would tell us how to live, what to believe, who to be. And people accepted these systems gratefully, not because they were stupid or weak, but because the alternative, the abyss of total freedom, was simply too much to bear. Better to live within a structure, even a restrictive one, than to drift in an ocean of infinite possibility with no compass, no map, no destination. The Grand Inquisitor understood this. In that famous confrontation, imagined within the pages of the brothers Karamazov, he explains to Christ himself why humanity must be protected from the terrible gift of freedom. People do not want to be free, he argues. They want to be fed, to be given miracles, to have authority over them. They want mystery and certainty and the comfort of knowing that someone wiser, someone stronger, is making the difficult decisions on their behalf. Christ offered humanity freedom, the freedom to choose faith without compulsion, to love without reward, to live without certainty. And humanity rejected it because freedom without guidance is not a gift but a curse, a burden too heavy for most souls to carry. This rejection is not a failure of courage or character. It is a recognition of our limitations, of the fact that we are finite beings trying to navigate an infinite reality. We cannot see the consequences of our actions stretching out through time. We cannot know whether the path we have chosen will lead to fulfillment or destruction. We move through life in darkness, making decisions based on incomplete information, driven by impulses we do not fully understand, shaped by forces beyond our control. And yet we are held responsible for the outcomes, judged by standards we had no part in creating, condemned or celebrated based on choices we made in ignorance and fear. No wonder, then, that we seek escape from this condition. No wonder that we construct elaborate systems to convince ourselves that our choices are not really choices at all, that we are merely following a plan laid out by nature or destiny or divine will. No wonder that we embrace determinism in its various forms, finding comfort in the idea that our actions are the inevitable result of genetics, environment, brain chemistry, social conditioning, anything that might relieve us of the terrible weight of genuine agency. But Dostoevsky would not allow us this comfort. He insisted on the reality of freedom even as he showed us its costs. His characters are not simply victims of circumstance or biology. They are moral agents, capable of choosing and therefore capable of sin, of guilt, of responsibility. Raskolnikov could have chosen not to murder. Ivan could have chosen to believe. Dmitri could have chosen restraint. The fact that they did not, the fact that they made the choices they made, is what gives their stories moral weight, what makes their struggles meaningful rather than merely pathetic. This insistence on moral agency in the face of all the forces that would deny it is perhaps Dostoevsky's most radical contribution to philosophy. In an age increasingly dominated by scientific materialism, by theories that reduced human beings to complex machines responding to stimuli, he maintained that we are something more, something irreducible to mere mechanism. We possess an inner life, a capacity for self-reflection and self-determination that cannot be fully explained by physical processes. We are not just biological organisms pursuing survival and reproduction. We are creatures of consciousness and conscience, capable of acting against our own interests, of choosing suffering, of sacrificing ourselves for principles that have no material benefit. And yet, Dostoevsky was not naive about human nature. He did not believe that our capacity for freedom automatically made us good or noble. On the contrary, he understood that freedom opens the door to evil as much as to virtue, that the same autonomy that allows us to rise to greatness also allows us to descend into depravity. The freedom to choose is also the freedom to choose wrongly, to harm ourselves and others, to create suffering where none existed before. This is the darker side of the paradox, the aspect we prefer not to acknowledge when we celebrate human liberty and self-determination. Consider Raskolnikov, the tormented protagonist of Crime and Punishment, who exercises his freedom in the most extreme way possible by taking another human life. He does not kill out of passion or desperation, not initially. He kills to prove a theory, to demonstrate that he is one of the extraordinary individuals who stand above conventional morality, who have the right to transgress ordinary ethical boundaries in pursuit of higher aims. He believes himself to be a Napoleon, a world historical figure whose actions are justified by their ultimate consequences, who need not be constrained by the rules that govern lesser beings. But the murder does not liberate him. Instead, it initiates a psychological torment far more brutal than any external punishment could be. Raskolnikov discovers that he cannot simply will himself beyond morality, cannot escape the weight of conscience through intellectual reasoning. The old pawnbroker may have been, as he tells himself, a worthless creature whose death benefited society. But he has still committed murder, still violated something fundamental in the moral order of the universe. And this violation haunts him, breaks him, drives him toward madness until he can no longer function, can no longer maintain the facade of normalcy he had hoped would protect him. What Dostoevsky reveals through Raskolnikov's suffering is that we are not as free as we imagine ourselves to be. We cannot simply choose our own values, create our own morality, decide for ourselves what is right and wrong. There are constraints on our freedom that go deeper than social convention or legal prohibition. There are aspects of our nature that rebel against certain kinds of actions, that punish us internally when we violate them, regardless of what we consciously believe or rationally justify. Raskolnikov thought he could murder without guilt because he had convinced himself intellectually that the murder was justified, but his conscience, that deeper part of himself that operates beneath the level of conscious reasoning, knows differently, and it torments him until he acknowledges the truth of what he has done. This is one of the central insights of Dostoevsky's work, that we cannot escape ourselves, cannot flee from our own nature, no matter how sophisticated our philosophies or how strong our will. We are not blank slates upon which we can write any character we choose. We are complex beings with built-in orientations, with moral intuitions that arise from sources deeper than culture or education. We can suppress these intuitions, ignore them, rationalize them away, but we cannot eliminate them. And when we act against them, we pay a price in psychological suffering that no external success can compensate for. Raskolnikov eventually confesses his crime, not because he is caught or because he fears punishment, but because he can no longer bear the weight of his guilt. The confession is an act of freedom as profound as the murder itself, perhaps more so because it requires him to abandon his pride, to admit his failure, to accept that he is not the extraordinary individual he imagined himself to be, but simply another human being subject to the same moral laws as everyone else. In confessing, he surrenders the grandiose vision of himself that motivated the murder. He gives up his claim to be beyond good and evil, acknowledges his ordinary humanity, accepts his place within the moral community he tried to transcend. And in this surrender, paradoxically, he finds the beginning of redemption. Not because confession earns him forgiveness, not because it somehow undoes the harm he has caused, but because it represents a return to truth, an alignment of his conscious understanding with the deeper reality of his nature. He stops lying to himself, stops pretending to be something he is not, accepts the full weight of what he has done. This acceptance does not bring happiness, at least not immediately. But it brings something perhaps more important, the possibility of authentic existence, of living in accordance with truth rather than in flight from it. This pattern repeats throughout Dostoevsky's work. His characters seek freedom through transgression, through the assertion of will against constraint, through the rejection of conventional morality and belief. And they discover that this kind of freedom is illusory, that it leads not to liberation, but to isolation, not to self-realization, but to self-destruction. True freedom, Dostoevsky suggests, lies not in the rejection of all constraints, but in the acceptance of the right constraints, not in the assertion of individual will against all else, but in the surrender of that will to something higher, something that gives life meaning and direction. But what is this higher thing? What are we supposed to surrender to? This is where Dostoevsky's vision becomes most challenging, most difficult to accept for the modern mind. For him, the answer was faith, specifically Christian faith, the belief in a loving God who gives human life ultimate significance and provides a foundation for moral truth. Without this foundation, Dostoevsky believed, everything collapses into nihilism and despair. If there is no God, then there is no objective morality, no reason to prefer one action over another, beyond personal preference or social utility. If there is no God, then we are alone in an indifferent universe, creating meaning for ourselves out of nothing, with no assurance that our creations have any validity beyond our own assertion. This is the terrible conclusion that Ivan Karamazov reaches in his rebellion against God. He cannot accept a universe in which innocent children suffer, in which the tears of even one child are the price of cosmic harmony. Better to reject such a God, better to reject the entire moral order than to accept it on such terms. And so Ivan declares that if God does not exist, then everything is permitted. Morality becomes a human invention with no transcendent validity. We are free to do whatever we wish, constrained only by our own preferences and the reactions of others. But Ivan's rebellion does not bring him peace. His rejection of God leads not to liberation, but to madness, to a confrontation with a devil who may be real or may be a projection of his own tormented psyche. He discovers that it is not so easy to live in a universe without moral meaning, that the human mind and heart rebel against such emptiness. We need meaning the way we need food and water. We cannot simply live from moment to moment, pursuing pleasure and avoiding pain with no larger framework to give our actions significance. The meaninglessness that follows from the death of God is not liberating, but suffocating, a void that swallows everything, rendering all our strivings and sufferings equally pointless. Yet even here, in this darkest of realizations, Dostoevsky finds a strange hope. For if we cannot live without meaning, if the human spirit rebels against nihilism even when our intellect embraces it, then perhaps this reveals something important about the structure of reality itself. Perhaps our need for meaning is not just a psychological quirk or evolutionary adaptation, but a clue to the fundamental nature of existence. Perhaps the universe actually is the kind of place where meaning is possible, where moral truth exists, where suffering and struggle are not simply pointless but serve some larger purpose we cannot fully comprehend. This is not a proof of God's existence, not in any logical or scientific sense. But it is a kind of evidence, an indication that we are not as alone as we fear, that there is some correspondence between our deepest needs and the ultimate nature of reality. We were made for meaning, and perhaps this means that meaning is built into the fabric of existence rather than being something we impose upon an indifferent cosmos. Our hunger for purpose might be like our hunger for food, pointing towards something real that can satisfy it, rather than being a cruel joke played by evolution on conscious beings trapped in a meaningless universe. But even if we accept this possibility, even if we open ourselves to the idea of transcendent meaning, we still face the problem of suffering. This is the stumbling block that trips up so many who seek faith. The question that seems to have no adequate answer. How can we believe in a loving God when the world is filled with so much pain, so much injustice, so much seemingly pointless cruelty? Children die of disease, innocents are tortured by the wicked. The virtuous suffer while the corrupt prosper. Where is God in all of this? Where is the loving providence that supposedly governs the universe? Dostoevsky did not shy away from these questions. He faced them directly, put them in the mouths of his most passionate and intelligent characters, allowed them to present the strongest possible case against faith. The Brothers Karamazov contains arguments against God's justice that have never been refuted, accusations that remain unanswerable in purely rational terms. And yet, despite these arguments, despite the weight of suffering and injustice that seems to contradict everything faith affirms, Dostoevsky held to his belief, not because he could explain suffering, not because he had some theodicy that made everything make sense, but because he had experienced something that transcended rational argument. What Dostoevsky experienced and what he tried to convey through his fiction was the reality of grace, of love that persists in the face of all reasons for despair, of hope that survives every disappointment. His novels are filled with characters who have every reason to give up, to surrender to bitterness and hatred, to embrace the nihilism that seems the only rational response to a world like ours. And some of them do succumb, but others, often the most unlikely ones, find within themselves the capacity to forgive, to love, to maintain faith despite everything. And this capacity, this inexplicable resilience of the human spirit, points towards something beyond the merely human, some source of strength and hope that we do not create for ourselves but receive as a gift. Consider Sonia, the young prostitute in Crime and Punishment who becomes Raskolnikov's unlikely guide toward redemption. She has every reason for despair. She has been forced into prostitution to support her family, has been degraded and abused, lives in poverty and shame. And yet she maintains her faith, continues to believe in God's love and mercy, finds in her suffering not a reason to reject God, but a path toward Him. She does not claim to understand why God allows such things to happen. She cannot explain the existence of evil or justify the suffering of the innocent. But she knows, with a knowledge that goes deeper than rational understanding, that she is loved, that her life has meaning, that even in her degradation she is infinitely valuable in God's eyes. This faith sustains her, gives her the strength not only to endure her own suffering, but to reach out to Raskolnikov in his torment. She recognizes in him a fellow sufferer, someone who has lost his way and needs guidance back to truth. And she offers him that guidance without judgment, without condemnation, with a pure compassion that seems to come from beyond herself. She becomes, in effect, Christ to him, embodying the divine love that persists in the face of all human ugliness and sin. What Sonia represents is the possibility of grace operating through human beings, of divine love making itself present in the world, despite all the evidence that would seem to contradict its existence. She is not perfect, not sinless, not particularly wise or eloquent, but she is open to something beyond herself, willing to be a vessel through which a higher love can flow. And this openness, this willingness to surrender her own will to God's will, transforms her from a victim into an agent of redemption, someone who can help others find their way back to truth and wholeness. This is the paradox that lies at the heart of Dostoevsky's understanding of freedom. We are most free not when we assert our will against all constraint, not when we rebel against every authority and tradition, not when we create our own values and live by them regardless of consequences. We are most free when we surrender ourselves to what is highest in us, when we align our will with truth and goodness and beauty, when we open ourselves to the transcendent source of meaning and value that gives our lives genuine significance. This surrender is not a loss of freedom, but its fulfillment, not a constraint upon our autonomy, but its proper expression. But this teaching is profoundly counterintuitive, difficult to accept for minds shaped by modern notions of liberty and self-determination. We have been taught to see freedom and constraint as opposites, to believe that any limitation on our autonomy is a form of oppression, that authentic existence requires us to throw off all external authorities and live according to our own lights. The very idea of surrender, of submission, of obedience to something beyond ourselves strikes us as a betrayal of human dignity, a return to the childish dependence we must outgrow if we are to become fully mature individuals. And yet our experience contradicts this teaching when we live according to nothing but our own desires, when we recognize no authority beyond our own preferences, when we make ourselves the ultimate arbiters of truth and value. We do not flourish. We become anxious, depressed, consumed by doubt and self-questioning. We lose the sense of purpose and direction that comes from participating in something larger than ourselves. We discover that autonomy without meaning is not freedom, but a kind of imprisonment, trapping us in the narrow circle of our own ego with no way out. The underground man exemplifies this condition. He is utterly free in the negative sense, bound by no conventions, constrained by no relationships, responsible to no one but himself. And he is miserable, consumed by spite and resentment, unable to connect with others or to find satisfaction in anything. His freedom has not empowered him, but has cut him off from everything that might give his life meaning and value. He is free the way a severed limb is free from the body, autonomous but dying, independent but lifeless. What would it take for the underground man to escape his condition? Not more freedom, not greater autonomy, not a more complete rejection of social conventions and moral norms. What he needs is precisely the opposite. Connection, commitment, the willingness to risk himself in relationship with others, to submit himself to values and purposes larger than his own ego. He needs to stop analyzing and start living, to stop holding himself apart and allow himself to be drawn into the messy, complicated, often painful web of human relationships that constitute genuine existence. But this is exactly what he cannot do. His consciousness, his terrible self-awareness, prevents him from the spontaneous engagement with life that would save him. He sees through everything, understands the mechanisms by which people deceive themselves into contentment, and cannot participate in these necessary illusions. He is too smart for his own good, too perceptive to embrace the comfortable lies that allow others to live without constant existential anguish. And so he remains trapped in his underground, analyzing, resenting, suffering, unable to escape, but equally unable to surrender the very consciousness that makes his suffering possible. This is perhaps the deepest paradox of all, that consciousness itself, The very quality that makes us human, that elevates us above the animals and allows us to contemplate our own existence, is also the source of our greatest suffering. An animal does not question the meaning of its life. It does not lie awake at night, wondering whether its actions have value or purpose. It simply lives, driven by instinct and appetite, at home in its existence in a way that human beings can never be. But we cannot return to that innocence. Once we have eaten from the tree of knowledge, once we have become self-aware, there is no going back. We are condemned to consciousness, to the burden of knowing that we exist and wondering why, to the terrible freedom of beings who must choose their own path without any guarantee that they are choosing correctly. And yet, Dostoevsky suggests even this burden can be transformed into a gift if we approach it rightly. Consciousness makes us suffer, but it also makes redemption possible. An animal cannot sin because it cannot choose, cannot fall because it was never capable of standing. But we can fall, and therefore we can also rise. We can descend into the depths of depravity and self-destruction, but we can also climb toward truth and goodness and love. Our freedom, terrible as it is what makes moral and spiritual life possible. What allows us to participate consciously in our own creation rather than simply being shaped by forces beyond our control. This is why Dostoevsky's novels so often focus on characters at their lowest point, on murderers and prostitutes and addicts and dreamers who have failed by every conventional measure. These are the people who have pushed freedom to its limit, who have explored the depths of human possibility and discovered what lies at the bottom. And having reached that bottom, having exhausted the possibilities of pure autonomy and self-will, they are positioned to discover something else, to open themselves to grace, to allow themselves to be lifted up by something beyond their own strength. The pattern of descent and ascent, of fall and redemption, runs through all of Dostoevsky's major works. Raskolnikov must commit murder before he can be saved. Dmitri Karamazov must be accused of patricide, must suffer imprisonment and the prospect of Siberia before he can find peace. Prince Mishkin must descend into the chaos of Russian society, must be destroyed by it, before his Christ-like nature can be fully revealed. Even Alyosha, the youngest Karamazov, who begins as a novice monk already dedicated to God, must witness his beloved elder's death and the scandal that follows before his faith can mature into something deep and unshakable. This pattern is not arbitrary or sadistic. It reflects Dostoevsky's understanding of how transformation actually occurs in human life. We do not change through rational argument or gradual improvement. We change through crisis, through confrontation with our own limits, through experiences that shatter our comfortable illusions and force us to rebuild ourselves from the ground up. The old self must die before the new self can be born. We must lose ourselves to find ourselves, must descend into darkness before we can appreciate light, must taste despair before we can know genuine hope. This is a harsh teaching, difficult to accept in an age that prefers gentler paths to transformation. We want growth to be comfortable, want to believe we can improve ourselves through small adjustments, through the application of techniques and practices that leave our fundamental sense of self intact. We want redemption without suffering, transformation without crisis, new life without the death of the old. But Dostoevsky insists that real change does not work this way, that the self we have constructed, the persona we have built up through years of adaptation and compromise and self-deception, must be broken down before something authentic can emerge. This breaking down is what happens to Raskolnikov in the aftermath of his crime. Everything he believed about himself, every assumption that structured his identity, proves false. He is not the extraordinary individual he imagined, not the Napoleon who can transgress ordinary morality without consequence, not the rational being who can murder without guilt. All of this collapses, leaving him naked and exposed, stripped of his defenses, vulnerable in a way he has never been before. And it is precisely in this vulnerable state that grace can reach him, that Sonia's love can penetrate his isolation, that the possibility of redemption can become real. The same pattern plays out in the brothers Karamazov with Dmitri. He is accused of murdering his father, a crime he did not actually commit, but one he desired with his whole heart. The accusation forces him to confront the truth about himself, to acknowledge the violence and chaos within him, to see clearly the kind of person he has been and the harm he has caused. And this confrontation, painful as it is, becomes the beginning of his transformation. He accepts suffering, embraces it even, seeing in it the possibility of purification, of becoming someone better than he was. This embrace of suffering is perhaps the most alien aspect of Dostoevsky's thought for contemporary readers. We live in an age dedicated to the elimination of suffering, to the pursuit of comfort and pleasure, and the avoidance of pain. We see suffering as something to be minimized, as an evil to be conquered through technology and social progress. The idea that suffering might have value, that it might serve a purpose in human development, strikes us as not just wrong but dangerous, a rationalization for cruelty and oppression. And yet our experience suggests otherwise. The people we admire most, the individuals we recognize as having achieved genuine wisdom and depth of character, are almost always people who have suffered significantly. They have endured loss, faced adversity, struggled with pain and doubt and despair. And through this struggle, they have developed qualities that cannot be acquired any other way. Compassion born of shared suffering, strength forged in the fire of tribulation, wisdom that comes only from having been broken and rebuilt. We recognize, perhaps without fully acknowledging it, that there is something about suffering that deepens us, that makes us more fully human, that opens us to dimensions of existence we would otherwise never know. Dostoevsky understood this not as abstract theory, but as lived experience. His own life was marked by suffering of the most extreme kind, the mock execution that brought him to the very edge of death, the years of hard labor in Siberia, the epilepsy that tormented him throughout his adult life, the deaths of his first wife and beloved brother, the grinding poverty that pursued him despite his literary success, the gambling addiction that brought him repeatedly to ruin. These were not experiences he sought out or welcomed. They were genuine suffering, real pain that left permanent marks on his psyche and his body. And yet he emerged from these experiences not broken but deepened, not destroyed but transformed. The man who returned from Siberia was not the same cocky young intellectual who had been arrested for revolutionary activities. He had seen into the depths of human nature, his own and others, had lived among murderers and thieves, and discovered in them the same capacity for nobility and baseness that exists in all human hearts. He had been stripped of his illusions about human perfectibility and social progress, forced to confront the darkness within himself and within the human condition as such. And from this confrontation came the great novels, works that plumb psychological and spiritual depths that few writers have ever matched. The suffering did not make him better in any simple or automatic way. It did not guarantee wisdom or virtue, but it created the conditions under which genuine transformation became possible, broke down the barriers of ego and pride that prevent us from seeing ourselves and others clearly, forced him to grapple with fundamental questions about meaning and value that comfortable people can usually avoid. Without the suffering, he might have remained a talented but shallow writer, producing works of cleverness and skill, but not of depth. The suffering made depth possible, opened up regions of human experience that exist but remain hidden until crisis forces us to acknowledge them. This is what he means when his characters speak of the necessity of suffering, when they embrace their punishment and even seek it out. They are not masochists finding perverse pleasure in pain. They are people who have come to understand that suffering can serve a purpose, that it can burn away the false self and reveal something truer beneath, that it can break the grip of pride and open us to grace. They have discovered that we cannot simply will ourselves to be better people, cannot transform ourselves through conscious effort and rational planning. We need something to break through our defenses, to shatter our carefully constructed self-images, to force us to confront truths we would prefer to avoid. And suffering, more than anything else, has this power. When we are comfortable, when life is going well, we can maintain our illusions about ourselves. We can believe that we are good people, that we are in control of our lives, that we understand ourselves and the world around us. Dostoevsky knew this because he lived it. He struggled with addiction to gambling, losing money he could not afford to lose, making choices that humiliated him and endangered his family, all while being fully aware of what he was doing. He was not stupid. He was not ignorant of the consequences. He simply contained within himself a compulsion stronger than his rational understanding, a drive towards self-destruction that coexisted with his genius, his compassion, his spiritual yearning. And rather than splitting himself in two, rather than trying to deny one half of his nature to preserve the other, he integrated both into his understanding of what it means to be human. He recognized that the gambler and the prophet were not two different people, but two aspects of the same complex soul, and that any honest account of human nature had to make room for both. This is why his characters feel so real, so uncomfortably familiar. They are not heroes or villains in any simple sense. They are people trying to navigate the impossible terrain of freedom, people discovering that they are capable of more and worse than they ever imagined. People learning that the hardest person to face is not some external enemy, but the stranger who looks back at them from the mirror, and in their struggles, we recognize our own. In their failures, we see reflections of our failures. In their small moments of grace, we find hope that grace might also be available to us, not because we have earned it or deserve it, but simply because we are human, and being human means having access to the full spectrum of possibility, from the demonic to the divine. As the night deepens and your mind begins to wander, let yourself remember that you are not alone in this struggle. Every person who has ever lived has faced this same paradox, this same burden of freedom, this same confrontation with the darkness within. Some have tried to escape it through denial, through distraction, through constructing elaborate defenses against self-knowledge. Others have descended into that darkness and become lost in it, unable to find their way back to the light. But some, a precious few, have learned to walk the narrow path between denial and despair, to acknowledge the darkness without being consumed by it, to accept their freedom without being crushed by its weight. These are the people Dostoevsky writes about, not because they are perfect, but because they are honest, not because they have transcended suffering, but because they have learned to meet it with open eyes and steady hearts. The paradox of freedom is that it offers us everything and guarantees us nothing. It gives us the power to shape our lives, but provides no blueprint for how to use that power. It places the entire responsibility for our becoming on our own shoulders, and then reveals that we are far weaker, far more confused, far more prone to self-sabotage than we ever wanted to admit. This is a terrible gift, but it is the only gift we have, and learning to accept it, learning to carry it without either denying its weight or collapsing beneath it, is perhaps the central task of human existence. Dostoevsky's darkest wisdom, then, is not that we are doomed, not that life is meaningless, not that suffering is all there is. His darkest wisdom is that suffering is meaningful, that it reveals to us truths we could learn no other way, that it strips away our illusions and forces us to confront what is actually real. And what is actually real is that we are free, and that this freedom includes the freedom to destroy ourselves, to hurt others, to choose darkness over light. But it also includes the freedom to change, to choose differently, to extend mercy to ourselves and others, to stumble towards something better even if we never fully arrive. The inner conflict that Dostoevsky maps so precisely in his novels is not a conflict between good and evil in the abstract. It is the conflict between different versions of ourselves, between the person we want to be and the person we actually are, between our aspirations and our actions, between our conscious intentions and our unconscious drives. This conflict cannot be resolved through simple willpower or moral determination. It is too deep for that, too fundamental. It is woven into the structure of consciousness itself. This capacity we have to observe ourselves, to judge ourselves, to be simultaneously the actor and the witness, the sinner and the judge. Raskolnikov's crime in Crime and Punishment is not simply the murder of the pawnbroker. His real crime is the attempt to transcend this fundamental conflict by force of will, to split himself into the extraordinary individual who stands above morality and the ordinary person who must submit to it. He wants to resolve the paradox by choosing one side completely, by becoming purely the strong, rational, superior being who can act without guilt or consequence. But this is impossible. The human psyche does not work this way. We cannot amputate parts of ourselves without bleeding. We cannot kill one aspect of our nature without poisoning the rest. And so Raskolnikov's attempt to transcend his humanity through crime leads not to strength, but to madness, not to clarity, but to confusion, not to freedom, but to a prison more confining than any physical cell. What saves him, if he is saved, is not moral reformation in the conventional sense. It is not that he decides to become good instead of evil. It is that he stops trying to be exceptional, stops trying to transcend the basic conditions of human existence, and accepts that he is simply a person, flawed and limited, and guilty and still somehow deserving of life, of love, of the possibility of redemption. This acceptance is humbling. It requires him to give up his grandiose self-image, his fantasy of being above the ordinary moral universe. But in giving this up, he gains something more valuable. He gains the possibility of genuine connection with another person, with Sonia, who has also suffered, who also knows what it means to be degraded and ashamed, and who offers him not absolution but companionship, not forgiveness but presence. This pattern repeats throughout Dostoevsky's work. Characters who try to escape the fundamental paradox of human nature through ideology, through crime, through assertion of will, invariably discover that escape is impossible. The underground man tries to escape through withdrawal, through nursing his resentment in isolation, through convincing himself that his inability to act is actually a form of superiority. But his isolation becomes a torture, his resentment a poison, his superiority a hollow shell that protects nothing and provides no comfort. Even Karamazov tries to escape through pure reason, through constructing a philosophical system that will explain everything and justify his rejection of a world that allows suffering. But his reason turns on itself, becomes a weapon that wounds him, manifests as the devil who comes to mock him with his own arguments. The characters who find peace, or at least the possibility of peace, are those who stop trying to escape. Alyosha does not try to solve the problem of suffering. He simply loves people in the midst of their suffering. Sonia does not have a philosophical system that explains why she must prostitute herself to support her family. She simply does what she must do and maintains, somehow, a spark of something pure within herself, despite the degradation. These are not intellectual solutions. They are existential positions, ways of being in the world that acknowledge its darkness while refusing to be consumed by despair. There is a deep connection here between Dostoevsky's insights and what we might call the psychology of sin and guilt. Not sin in the narrow religious sense, though Dostoevsky was profoundly religious, but sin as a recognition of our capacity to harm ourselves and others, to fall short of what we know we could be, to choose destruction when we know better, and guilt not as neurotic self-punishment, but as an appropriate response to this recognition, a signal that we have violated something important, that we have betrayed ourselves or others in some fundamental way. Modern psychology often wants to eliminate guilt, to see it as a destructive emotion that should be overcome or worked through. And certainly, neurotic guilt, guilt that is disproportionate or irrational, can be paralyzing and destructive. But Dostoevsky understood that there is also such a thing as legitimate guilt, guilt that arises from genuine transgression, and that the attempt to eliminate this guilt without addressing the underlying transgression is a form of self-deception that leads not to health but to sickness. Raskolnikov cannot simply decide not to feel guilty about murder. His guilt is the appropriate response to what he has done, the signal that he is still human, still connected to the moral universe he tried to place himself above. His suffering is not meaningless, it is the process by which he reconnects with his own humanity. This is where Dostoevsky's vision becomes truly dark, because what he suggests is that we actually need guilt, need the capacity for self-judgment, need to suffer the consequences of our choices. Not because suffering is good in itself, but because without it we become monsters, creatures incapable of genuine relationship or transformation. The person who can commit harm without guilt is not free. They are stunted, incomplete, cut off from the deepest dimensions of human experience. Their freedom is the freedom of the psychopath, the freedom that comes from having no internal compass, no connection to others, no capacity for empathy or remorse. This is not freedom to be envied. It is a kind of death, a hollowing out of everything that makes life meaningful. But here is the even darker twist. Dostoevsky recognized that humans do not simply stumble into guilt. We seek it out. We engineer situations that will guarantee our condemnation. We confess to crimes we did not commit. We exaggerate our failures and minimize our successes. We punish ourselves with a severity no external judge would impose. Why? Because guilt, like suffering, confirms our existence. It proves that we matter enough to be judged, that our choices have weight, that we are morally significant beings in a morally significant universe. The person who feels no guilt is not free from judgment. They are beneath judgment, irrelevant, a moral cipher. But the person who agonizes over their failures, who cannot forgive themselves for their transgressions, who carries the weight of their choices like a stone in their chest, this person knows they are real. Their suffering is evidence of their significance. This creates a terrible cycle. We commit transgressions, small or large, and then we punish ourselves for these transgressions, and the punishment becomes a kind of satisfaction, a grim comfort. We have done something wrong, but we are suffering for it, and in the suffering we find a strange relief. Justice is being served, even if we are serving it ourselves. But this self-punishment rarely leads to transformation. Instead, it becomes its own end, a way of simultaneously acknowledging our failures and avoiding the hard work of changing. We beat ourselves up. We wallow in guilt. We declare ourselves irredeemable. And in this very declaration, we find permission to keep doing what we were doing. After all, if we are truly beyond redemption, why bother trying to change? Dostoevsky saw this pattern clearly, and he saw that it was a trap. The person who cannot forgive themselves is not morally superior to the person who forgives themselves too easily. They are simply stuck, frozen in a moment of transgression, unable to move forward because they are clinging to their guilt as though it were an identity. And in some sense it is. We become the sum of our failures, the catalogue of our sins, and we defend this identity as fiercely as we would defend anything we value, because to let it go would be to confront the terrifying question, if I am not my failures, then who am I? This is where the paradox deepens. We cannot move beyond guilt without first fully accepting it. We cannot forgive ourselves without first honestly acknowledging what we have done. The path to redemption does not go around the confession, it goes through it. We must stand in the full light of our own judgment, must see ourselves without flinching or making excuses, must accept responsibility for the harm we have caused, the opportunities we have squandered, the ways we have betrayed ourselves and others. This is agonizing. This is the descent into the underground, into the dark cellar of self-knowledge, where all our comfortable illusions are stripped away. But on the other side of this descent, if we can make it to the other side, something changes. Not that we become innocent again. We do not. The crimes remain crimes. The failures remain failures. But we are no longer defined solely by them. We become larger than our worst moments. We discover that we contain the capacity for both transgression and repentance, both cruelty and compassion, both destruction and creation. And in discovering this, we find a strange freedom. Not the freedom from judgment, but the freedom to continue living despite judgment. To move forward, carrying our failures with us, but not being crushed by them. Dostoevsky's characters who experience something like redemption do not escape their guilt. Raskolnikov will always be a murderer. Dmitri Karamazov will always be the dissolute sensualist who nearly killed his father. But they accept this reality, they bear it, and they choose to live anyway. They choose to love anyway. They choose to believe that their life still has meaning despite what they have done. This is not a cheap grace. This is costly, hard-won, earned through suffering and honest self-examination. But it is real in a way that easy absolution never could be. As you sink deeper into rest, let yourself feel the weight of your own guilt, your own failures, without trying to immediately resolve them or push them away. Let them be present. Let them speak to you about where you have fallen short, where you have harmed others, where you have betrayed your own values. This is not pleasant, but it is necessary, because only by fully acknowledging what is can we begin to move toward what might be. Only by accepting our capacity for darkness can we make genuine choices toward light. The paradox of the soul that Dostoevsky explores is this: we are most free when we accept our lack of freedom, most powerful when we acknowledge our weakness, most human when we face our capacity for inhumanity. The person who believes they are always right, always good, always justified in their choices, is not free. They are imprisoned in a rigid self-image that cannot accommodate complexity or growth. But the person who knows they are capable of terrible things, who has faced the darkness within and not looked away, this person can choose with genuine freedom. They are not compelled by the need to maintain an illusion of innocence. They can act from a place of honest self-knowledge, accepting that they will fail again, will hurt others again, will fall short again, and choosing to try anyway. This is the search for meaning through chaos and darkness that forms the heart of Dostoevsky's vision. Meaning does not come from avoiding chaos, it comes from engaging with it, from entering the whirlwind and allowing it to transform you. Darkness is not the enemy of light. It is the place where light becomes visible, where we can see what truly matters because everything false has been burned away. The characters in Dostoevsky's novels who find peace do not find it by escaping suffering. They find it by going deeper into suffering than they thought possible, by discovering that on the other side of despair there is something that is not exactly hope, but something more resilient than hope, something that might be called faith or love, or simply the stubborn refusal to surrender to nothingness. There is a moment in The Idiot where Prince Mishkin, the novel's Christ-like figure, is discussing capital punishment. He describes the final moments of a man about to be executed, the way time slows down, the way every second becomes an eternity, the way the condemned man looks at the world with new eyes because he knows he is seeing it for the last time. And Mishkin says that those final moments contain all of life, that in them the man experiences something that ordinary people, going about their comfortable lives, never experience, a complete and total awareness of existence, an absolute presence to the moment because there is no future to escape into. This is a terrible gift, but it is a gift. It is the gift of reality unfiltered by hope or fear or the endless distractions we use to avoid being fully present to our lives. Dostoevsky is suggesting something radical here. He is suggesting that we need extremity, need to be pushed to our limits, need to face death or suffering or the utter collapse of our world in order to wake up to what is actually real. Our comfortable lives, our routines and distractions and carefully maintained illusions, these are not really life. They are a kind of sleep, a way of avoiding life. And so, paradoxically, suffering becomes the thing that wakes us up, that forces us to be present, that strips away all the comfortable lies we tell ourselves and leaves us standing naked before reality. This is not to romanticize suffering or to suggest that we should seek it out. Dostoevsky knew suffering intimately and would not wish it on anyone. But he also knew that suffering is inevitable, that it comes for all of us eventually, and that the question is not how to avoid it, but how to meet it, how to allow it to transform us rather than destroy us. The person who has never suffered may seem fortunate, but they are also, in some sense, incomplete. They have not been tested. They do not know what they are capable of, either for good or for ill. They live on the surface of life, never diving deep, never discovering what lies beneath. The characters in Dostoevsky's novels are always diving deep. They are compelled into the depths by their choices, their crimes, their obsessions. And in those depths, they discover things about themselves that they would have preferred not to know. They discover their capacity for cruelty, their weakness, their cowardice. But they also discover something else. They discover resilience they did not know they had. They discover that they can endure more than they thought possible. They discover that love can survive even in hell, that meaning can be found even in the most degraded circumstances, that the human spirit is far stronger and stranger than any philosophy or psychology has yet been able to explain. This is where Dostoevsky's vision becomes almost mystical, because what he suggests is that the soul, the deepest core of our being, is not simply the product of our experiences or our biology or our social conditioning. It is something more fundamental, something that precedes and survives all the circumstances of our existence. And this soul, this essential self, can only be discovered through suffering, through the stripping away of everything superficial, everything borrowed, everything that is not truly us. We have to lose everything we thought we were in order to discover who we actually are. This is the liberation that comes through darkness, not a liberation from suffering, but a liberation through it. Not an escape from the prison of self, but a descent into the self so complete that we pass through to the other side, to a place where the boundaries of self begin to dissolve, where we recognize our fundamental connection to all suffering beings, where compassion arises not as a moral obligation, but as a spontaneous response to our perception of shared humanity. Sonia in Crime and Punishment embodies this perfectly. She has been degraded, forced into prostitution, subjected to every form of humiliation. But she has not been destroyed. Something in her remains pure, not in the sense of unsullied, but in the sense of essential, undamaged at the deepest level. And this purity, born of suffering rather than protected from it, becomes the thing that can reach Raskolnikov when nothing else can. She does not lecture him or judge him or offer him easy answers. She simply is present with him in his suffering, recognizing in him what she recognizes in herself, a fellow human being struggling with the unbearable weight of existence. And in that recognition, something passes between them that might be called grace. This is Dostoevsky's vision of redemption. It does not come from above, from some external source of forgiveness or absolution. It comes from below, from the depths of suffering, from the encounter between two people who have both descended into darkness and found each other there. It is redemption through solidarity, through the recognition that we are all sinners, all sufferers, all struggling to make meaning out of chaos, and that this shared struggle is itself a form of meaning, perhaps the only form of meaning that can survive the honest acknowledgement of how terrible and absurd and unjust existence can be. As the night wraps around you and your consciousness begins to drift, let yourself sink into this understanding. You are not alone in your darkness. You are not unique in your suffering. You are not exceptional in your capacity for self-destruction. You are simply human, carrying the same burden that every human has carried since consciousness first emerged and humans became capable of judging themselves, of wondering if they should exist at all. This burden is heavy, but it is also what connects you to everyone else. What makes compassion possible? What allows you to understand others because you have learned to understand yourself? The paradox of freedom resolves itself not through logic but through love. Not romantic love necessarily, though that can be part of it, but the deeper love that recognizes the value of existence even in the midst of suffering, that affirms life even while acknowledging all its pain and injustice and absurdity. This is the love that Alyosha represents. The love that can look at Ivan's intellectual rejection of God's creation and respond not with argument but with a kiss, not with explanation but with affirmation. Yes, you are right, the world is terrible. Yes, suffering is unbearable. Yes, the existence of evil is a scandal that cannot be explained away. And yet, I kiss you, and yet I choose to love. And yet I say yes to life. This is not rational. It cannot be defended philosophically. It is a leap, an act of faith, a decision to affirm what cannot be justified. And this, Dostoevsky suggests, is what it means to be truly free. Not free from the burden of choice, not free from suffering or guilt or the knowledge of our own darkness, but free to choose love despite all these things. Free to affirm existence even when existence seems impossible to affirm. Free to continue despite all the good reasons to give up.